Okay, we're back online.
Yeah, I remember that.
I don't know. And now we're going to hear from Robert Smith and Ryan Hardy. Mason.
First name is Robert Mason.
Okay.
I believe there is another Robert Smith, is that right? Yes. That's why.
Who you have testifying? So that I have the wrong folder.
So you might not. Oh, okay, yeah. You have Peter.
Oh well, just go. And these are both Invenergy witnesses, correct?
Thank you, Madam Chair.
We need to swear, shall we swear them in?
We switch without color.
Yeah, I know. It felt like a little spot. Raise your right hand.
Thank you. Invenergy's next witnesses are Mason Smith and Ryan Hardy of PA Consulting Group located in Cambridge, Mass. Mr. Smith, before you is what has been marked as Invenergy Exhibits 74, 75, 76A, and 76B. Invenergy Exhibit 74 is your curriculum vitae, is that correct?
Correct.
Do you have any revisions to your CV?
I do not.
Invenergy Exhibit 75 is the pre-filed direct testimony of Robert Tebaldi. As stated in your pre-filed rebuttal testimony, Mr. Tebaldi is unable to be here today due to scheduling and a new job. Do you fully adopt Mr. Tebaldi's pre-filed testimony as your own?
I do adopt his testimony, and in fact, I've been involved in the analysis and helped draft the application and testimony throughout.
Okay. As you and Mr. Tebaldi prepared this testimony some time ago, I want to ask that if I were to ask the questions that are presented in the direct testimony, would the answers be the same today, or are there changes or corrections that you would like to point out?
Generally the same, with the changing commercial online date of the two units. There are some numbers and dates that have changed, and those have all been reflected in Exhibit 147.
Invenergy Exhibit 76A is your pre-filed rebuttal testimony, and Invenergy Exhibit 76B is your pre-filed supplemental testimony. Is that correct?
Correct.
If I were to ask you questions that are prepared in this rebuttal and supplemental testimony, would the answers be the same today, or are there changes or corrections that you'd like to point out?
They would generally be the same, and as with my previous response, there are, with the changing commercial online dates of the two units, there are some numbers and dates that have changed slightly, and all of those would be reflected in the latest Exhibit 147.
Mr. Smith is now available for questions.
We could just, before quite the questions from Mr. Smith, I'll just also do a run-through for Mr. Hardy, same.
Yes, I was going to say, if they're not actually testifying as a panel, they both shouldn't be sitting there.
Right.
But if they are,
They
should both be sworn in and asked questions.
Joanne, were they both sworn? Thank you. Mr. Hardy, similar questions with regard to the exhibits that you'll be taking responsibility for. You should have before you exhibits 35, 36, 37A, and 37B. Nicole will help you with that. Turn your attention first to 35, the curriculum vitae.
Yes,
And is that that's your curriculum vitae that we filed in this proceeding?
that's correct.
Do you have any changes, corrections, or modifications to that?
I do not.
Okay. Turning to 36, which is your pre-filed direct testimony.
Yes.
Again, I know that that was prepared some time ago. I want to focus just on the employment aspect. There's a section of your testimony regarding employment, which is the subject for today. With regard to the information in that section of your testimony, are there any changes that you would like to point out at this time?
There are no changes to my answers. Similarly, due to the change in online date for the facility, some of the references to dates in those corresponding numbers have changed. That's been reflected in the response to the Division of Planning's data request, Exhibit 147.
Thank you. And same question with regard to Exhibit 37A, which is your pre-filed rebuttal.
Yes, and similar answer on the rebuttal. Any references to dates related to the pushback of online date for Clear River, those updates are reflected in Exhibit 147.
And finally, with regard to Exhibit 37B, your pre-filed supplemental testimony, same question.
Yeah, and again, same answer. So answers are the same. References to dates regarding the pushback of Clear River, and that's all been updated and reflected in Exhibit 147.
Okay, great. Mr. Hardy and Mr. Smith are now available for questions with regard to the employment aspects of testimony.
Other question?
No, I have no questions for either of us on the subject. We do reserve our right, but Mr. Hardy comes back in September to talk about greenhouse gases and October to talk about these. Those subjects are not for us.
OER has no questions.
We do have a few questions. Good afternoon, Mrs. Smith and Mr. Hardy. I'm Mike McElroy. Mr. Hardy, we've met before. I'm the lawyer for the town of Bartlesville.
Afternoon.
I do want to emphasize for the record and for our discussions as we move forward that under the ground rules for the testimony here today, the only subject that's on the table is the subject of jobs and employment. That's probably the only subject, Mr. Mason, I'll be talking to you about. Certainly, it's the only subject we're talking to both of you about today, but later on, Mr. Hardy, you and I will talk about other issues. So,
Yeah.
I also need to give you a little qualification. I did not know until later this morning that you were going to testify as a panel. And so when I prepared my cross-examination, I did it individually for the two of you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with my cross-examination for Mr. Hardy, but I like the idea of a panel. I think it moves things along. So if I ask a question of Mr. Hardy and Mr. Mason, you've got a point you would like to make, feel free to just jump on in and add it, okay? It's not going to offend me in the least. I think it moves things along.
Okay, I'll do that.
Thank you. So, Mr. Hardy, as I understand it, and looking at your pre-filed direct testimony, you've identified three general categories of claimed economic benefits. These are, as best I can tell, construction of the facility, the then ongoing operation of the facility after the construction is complete, and power market cost savings to Rhode Island ratepayers. Are those the three main baskets?
That's correct.
Since the original filing with the Energy Facilities Siting Board, which you assisted in preparing, I'm assuming we're talking about now the application itself and primarily Section 5.1, correct? That's why we're here today.
Yes.
You have revised your analysis of employment and job impacts, correct?
That's correct.
About how many times have you revised it?
I believe we've revised it probably 3 times.
Okay. And your most recent revision is January 9th of this year?
That's correct.
And that was done in the form of a letter from PA, which is your company?
That's correct.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand it, the 2 main reasons for the revisions to your analysis are that, and remember we're talking jobs today, is that your original analysis assumed that Unit 2 would clear FCA 12, but it was in fact disqualified from FCA 12. And the second is that Invenergy submitted a revised water plan. Those are the 2 basic reasons.
I would say as far as our calculation of jobs and economic impact, really, I would boil the assumption down to the assumption around the online dates for both Clear River 1 and Clear River 2. Those are really the assumptions that have changed, and some of the reasons you call out are attribute to that. But from our perspective, it was the change in online date for Clear River 1 and 2.
And the change in online date was directly affected by the disqualification from FCA 12.
Among other things, I think that's correct.
Now, your most recent version, as I understand it, assumes that Unit 2 will A, be qualified in FCA 13, and B, will in fact clear 13, correct?
That's correct.
Would you agree with me that your analysis would have to be revised again if Unit 2 is once again disqualified from 13?
Not necessarily. I think the analysis would have to be requalified to the extent that it is our view that the online date will move by another year. So that, I mean, that is a function of the schedule. So clearing FCA is obviously important, but Clear River 1 has already cleared an FCA. It has an obligation to come online. Similarly, I think it is up to Invenergy, assuming that, of course, if they have an EFSB permit for the facility, to build and meet that online date.
But the assumption in your current analysis is that Unit 2 will in fact clear 13. If it does not, either because it's disqualified again or because it simply does not clear even after being qualified, would that not have some effect on your projections?
Again, I guess I would answer that question and say I would separate the fact of clearing the auction from the assumption of what the online date is. So, simply put, Clear River 2 could still be built and meet the online date even if it does not clear FCA 13.
Do you think that's a likelihood? That if it does not clear FCA 13, there will be no slip in the schedule that you've assumed in your current analysis?
I think the schedule depends on a multitude of factors. Clearing the FCA is certainly one of them, but that's probably a better question for Invenergy in terms of their decision to build the plant.
Well, would you agree with me if I said that the failure to either be qualified or to clear in FCA 13 could have an effect on the schedule that could require another revision?
It could have an effect on the schedule, yes.
All right, thank you. Now, you've expressed the opinion before, let me back up. You've expressed opinions in the past about Unit 2 and your projections as to whether or not it will clear the forward capacity auction, correct?
That's correct.
So you filed testimony in which you expressed the opinion that Unit 2 would clear in FCA 11, correct?
That's correct.
But it didn't clear, correct?
It did not clear FCA 11.
Right. And then you filed testimony expressing the opinion that Unit 2 would clear FCA 12, correct?
That's correct.
But it was disqualified and obviously did not clear FCA 12, correct?
That's correct.
What is the basis of your current prediction that Unit 2 will get an award in FCA 13?
This voice an objection. We're going to have an entire day set aside in September or October to get into the entire discussion about need, the capacity markets, the ISO's process. That's a lot of information, a lot of detail that we're going to go through, in quite a lot of detail another day. We're here today to talk about employment and jobs, as I understand it. So I'm not sure where we're going.
These are basically preliminary questions. The jobs analysis is dependent on the timeline, when the people are working and how much they're making during those particular years. I'm trying to probe his assumptions with regard to what years he in fact is including in that analysis and how realistic those assumptions are. I'm certainly not trying to go into the kind of detail with regard to the need for the project that we'll be going into later.
Okay, I do agree that it's completely bound up, that is the jobs and employment are completely bound up with the plans being built. So I will allow Mr. McElroy to ask those questions.
And I have very little in this area, Madam Chair. But let me just back up and start again. I would assume that you believe, you're of the opinion, that if Unit 2 is allowed to participate in FCA 13, you think it will get in a capacity award, correct?
That's correct.
All right. And could you just tell me what that's based on?
Sure, it's based on, so we project, we forecast the demand or the need for capacity for New England as a whole. We also forecast a view of the supply in New England, including potential additions and potential retirements. And then we project a clearing price for the forward capacity auction. That's all part of our analysis, and it assumes, again, given there is a permit for the facility, that they would participate in that auction and clear.
And what is your level of confidence regarding your expectation about them clearing in FCA 13? Would you say it's the same as your prediction about 11 and 12, higher than or less than?
I would say that, we base our projections based on the best available knowledge at the time. Now, this obviously has played out over a number of years. There's been delays related to permits. We can't determine when that will happen. So, based on our view today and with this hearing moving forward, it is our expectation that it would participate and clear the auction.
Well, I understand that. We already established that. What I'm asking you is your expectation level that Unit 2 will clear 13 higher than, lower than, or about the same as your expectation level was that Unit 2 would clear FCA 11 and FCA 12?
I mean, our expectation level is, I would say, the same.
Okay.
That's, at this time, based on the information that we have.
Now, you would agree with me that there are a significant number of construction jobs that are going to be required in order to build this plan if it gets approved, correct?
That's correct.
What percentage of these workers did you assume would be Rhode Island residents?
Okay.
Feel free to jump in.
Of the construction laborers, the number is 87%.
Now, would you agree that the construction jobs are going to be short-term jobs? I won't use the word temporary, but short-term jobs as opposed to permanent jobs.
I guess I would say on a construction jobs basis, they're longer term than most.
But there's still 2 years, 3 years, and then they go away.
2 to 3 years. Yes.
Could you tell me what your wage and benefit assumptions were for the average construction worker? In terms of dollars.
That number is based on an internal assumption that stems from the JEDI model. So I can't speak to the exact breakdown, but I do know that they're both included in the ultimate compensation, labor compensation number.
You have no idea what the assumed wage rate is going to be for these workers?
Well, I can tell you that the average wage plus benefits is going to be, for direct workers, will be somewhere about $170,000, something like that. Sorry, the jobs and economic development.
All the Star Wars people, their ears perked up.
That's an NREL model that we use an input-output model that we use to model the economic impacts.
Would you agree with me that and you're saying that approximate $170,000 number is inclusive of benefits?
Correct.
All right. Would you agree with me that if instead of using $170,000 for the assumption, the input into the model was $90,000, how would that affect the output, the analysis?
The inputs into the model are on a project cost basis, so there is not an individual input that would speak to the wages. So the actual input would be a breakdown of various project costs. So it might be X $1 million, for example, for labor.
So what you're saying is this model does not allow you to make an individualized input into the model for the wages and benefits that will in fact be paid. It falls out as some sort of percentage of the total cost of the job.
It is the earnings and output and jobs are an output of the model. The earnings and economic output and jobs are an output of the model. You can make adjustments to change your input assumptions, sure, and that would of course change the output that would come from the model.
Well, could you change the assumptions so that the total dollar wages and benefits are $90,000 instead of $170,000?
You could definitely do that in IMPLAN. I can't say whether you could do that effectively in JEDI, but I'm sure that there's a way to do that.
Right. And if you were to do that and make that substitution, and you were capable of doing that, can you tell me what the approximate effect would be on the analysis that you've put forth?
I can't estimate the impact, but I can say that you're correct. If you have a lower wage plus benefits input, you would have a lower. You may have a higher jobs output actually, because you're getting more jobs per input dollars. So you may have a higher jobs output, and then you would have a lower earnings output.
So we're focused here today on the benefits of these jobs. Were you here when Mr. Sabatoni testified?
I was.
And did you hear him testify that he expected that, I think he said it was the low average, but the low average wage would be about $60,000 and the benefits would be about $30,000 for a total of $90,000. You heard him say that?
I did hear him say the $60,000 for the wage. I heard him mention that number. I wasn't sure exactly what group of workers that he was speaking to, but I thought his benefits number was higher than that, but I didn't hear the 30,000 stated specifically.
I think the record will show it was $30,000. And what I'm trying to get a handle on is if the models that you've run and which have projected these jobs and employment benefits have overstated the wages and benefits on the order of $170,000 versus what is expected to be closer to $90,000. Would you agree with me that the benefits have been correspondingly overstated?
No, I would. I mean, the jobs themselves are an output of the model. So if you say we're gonna need $100 million in labor to complete this, then ultimately the model takes that $100 million and based on the assumption around wages and benefits tells you how many jobs come out. So in this case, if you said, okay, we're the team, the laborers that are completing this work are getting paid less than that $170,000 assumption, then your jobs number would go up because your denominator is getting lower.
I guess I'm having a hard time. This is not my area of expertise, but I'm having a hard time figuring out why the number of jobs would go up. The developer is saying that here's about how many jobs we think we're going to need. You're saying the model drives that, not the developer?
I think that's the difference in what I'm saying versus what you're saying. The developer says, we think we're going to need to spend X million dollars on construction labor for this. They don't say, here's how many construction laborers that we need for this. So that as a result, the jobs number is getting driven by what you're assuming for the X million dollars of input, as well as the assumed earnings plus benefits. Do you understand?
Not completely, because it seems to me that the developer would know best how many employees they're going to need on site in order to build this, and the union representative is telling us that the average wages and benefits on the low side, but the average would be about 90,000, but your model uses 170. So I'm saying something's not matching here. Do you understand my confusion? I mean, we've been through it. I think you've answered the question, and I don't want to belabor the point, but I do still have some confusion.
I guess I would just add, I'm not sure the developer would determine the number of jobs that are needed for construction. I think that is something that's determined by the labor union in conjunction with the EPC contractor. I think what Invenergy determines is the amount of money, they have a good understanding of the amount of money it costs to build the plant, including the portion of that cost that's labor. That information is provided to us. We use that information to forecast, using JEDI and IMPLAN, the amount of jobs and the economic impact. I think some of the confusion is you're taking the number that Mr. Sabatoni said, which I believe was a minimum number, not the average.
He said it was a conservative low average, and he said the benefits would stay the same. He did say...
But he said it would, I think he said it wouldn't be less than that number, and it would certainly be more, particularly for higher skilled labor.
Yes.
So I think you have a range of labor costs, ultimately, that probably start at 60,000 and go up from there. The way that we have calculated jobs and that economic impact is to say, if you have X number of dollars that are spent on labor to build a power plant, this model then determines, based on the shares of in-state and out-of-state and local and all of that numbers, that relates to a number of jobs and the average amount of compensation that then feeds what that economic impact is. So if the question is, if all of a sudden labor becomes 50% cheaper, which I don't think that it does, but I don't think that that changes the labor cost of what it costs to build a power plant, which I think Invenergy has a good understanding of what that number is. That's what feeds the jobs analysis.
Okay.
Could I just ask a follow-up? What if, you said you heard Mr. Sabatoni?
Yes.
So if the objective was to build the plant twice as fast, and they need to mobilize a labor force to work double shifts and more, presumably for overtime, would that then increase the cost?
I would expect that it would, and I think Mr. Sabatoni sort of indicated that because he started to talk about double shifts and potentially overtime, and I believe that the wages and for overtime and things would certainly accrue a number that on an annualized basis would be much higher.
Now, the ongoing operation of the facility will create about 23 on-site jobs, correct?
That's correct.
And you heard my questioning of Mr. Sabatoni. You're aware, have you been up to Barberville? Have you been to Barberville? You know it's in the
Yes.
northwest corner of the state.
Yes.
And it's very close to the borders of both Massachusetts and Connecticut.
Yes. We have visited the site.
I'm going to refer a little bit to the tables that you have in section 5.1. You don't necessarily need to look at them because they're very general questions. But you assumed in table 5.1-2 that 100% of the operations and maintenance phase labor benefits would accrue exclusively to Rhode Island. Is that correct?
Mike, when you say table 5.1, could you just point to which document you're talking about?
It's the regional application, page 24, table 5.1-2. And the table has an item for labor and then a column for local share, and it says 100% next to labor.
That's correct.
Is this again driven by the model, or do you really believe that the ongoing permanent operation of this facility in the northwest corner of the state will have 0 employees from either Massachusetts or Connecticut?
The Rhode Island share, those local share numbers that you're citing in that table the model will offer its national average that you can move, that you can employ, or you can adjust those numbers based on better knowledge for the state in question. So in this case, that 100% is also the kind of default assumption in the model. And I would believe that it is accurate, that it could accurately reflect the ongoing operation or the local share of the ongoing operation of the facility.
So you really personally believe that not one permanent employee of this facility located 5 miles from Massachusetts or 3 miles from Connecticut is going to have any employees other than Rhode Island residents? That's your firm belief?
My belief is that that's the best assumption. It's certainly possible that people could come from other states and work at the facility, but I would say that the best ongoing assumption there is that people are going to live where they work. If they're, especially if we're talking about an operating job that may be a 20-year job, say.
If people live 5 miles away from the plant over the line in Connecticut, or Massachusetts, or 3 miles away from the plant over the line in Connecticut, are they not living where they work?
Again, I'd say that is certainly a possible scenario. I do feel like the best assumption here is going to be that 100% of the workers are going to live in the state that they're working in. It is. I'm not by any means saying that it's not possible that one of these workers or 2 of these workers could come from Massachusetts or Connecticut.
Have you looked at the employees of the Ocean State Power Plant to determine what percentage of those employees lives in Rhode Island?
I have not.
Now I'm going to be looking again at the original application. And again, I'm on these 3 tables in section 5.1. Right now I'm on table 5.1-4, which is on page 27. Maybe if we could get that up on the screen, that would be helpful. Thank you very much. What I did, again, Mr. Mason, Mr. Harvey, it doesn't matter, is I looked at the first line. It says employment impact in FTEs per year. I'm assuming FTE means full-time equivalents.
Correct.
And the first subline is during the construction period. Now, I fully recognize that when this application was filed, the time period was different. So you had 2016, 17, 18. Obviously, none of those years apply right now, but they've all just shifted forward, correct?
Correct.
Right. But what I'm doing is I'm looking at it and I'm saying during the construction period, if I add up those numbers, 147, 2256, 2921, and 786, I get $6,110, subject to check. And if you'd like to check it, I said dollars. So obviously, I meant FTEs. Does that sound about right to you? It'd be about 6,000.
Let me just draw one distinction here. So this table here is referencing Rhode Island and the surrounding region. So that would, okay. So that does not speak to just the Rhode Island share.
This is Rhode Island. People who might come from Mass, people who might come from Connecticut, New Hampshire, whatever it is during the construction period. It looks like you're projecting roughly 6,100 FTEs during that 4-year construction period. Do I have that right?
You do, adding up those numbers. I'm trying to get my
I have a calculator.
application. No, I'm trying to get my application to agree with the one I'm seeing here to agree with yours, and it doesn't in terms of the table number.
That's probably because this is the original application we're working on, and it's been revised.
Okay. Do I agree that those numbers add to about 6,000? I do.
All right, good. Thank you. And again, to reemphasize what you stated earlier, this is not just Rhode Island employees, this is everybody who comes in from the surrounding region as well, all added together, correct?
Correct. So the way that we've constructed this is by setting the local share for all elements that could be met from the broader region to 100% instead of the Rhode Island share.
Got it. But what you did do is you did a separate table, which is 5.1-3. If it's possible to bring that one up. It's on page 25. Thank you very much. And this is, as it says at the top, Rhode Island only, correct?
Correct.
All right. And so, again, recognizing that the years are going to shift, what I did is I looked at construction period, the top subheading, and I added up 47, 718, 930, and 250. And I came up to about 1,900 jobs, or 1,900 FTEs. Does that sound right?
That does sound right for this table. Again, I think this is a different version of the application that I'm looking at right here. So there is an updated version of the application that follows this.
I understand that. It's not significantly different though, is it?
On that line item, not major, no major differences.
So what I did is I took the 1,900 and compared it to the 6,100, and I concluded that approximately 30% of the FTEs would be coming from Rhode Island. Would you agree with that?
This includes this number here, so this construction period number includes direct, indirect, and induced jobs. So it does not speak to the on-site jobs only.
Oh, I understand that.
Okay.
As did the other table, correct, for Rhode Island and surrounding areas.
Correct.
So the two tables are apples to apples.
The two tables are apples to apples, but you can't use these two tables to read into the percentage of on-site jobs that would be occupied by Rhode Island labor.
And I'm not trying to do that. I'm talking about all jobs. That would be Rhode Island labor versus all jobs, whether they're direct, indirect, or induced.
All jobs, yes. All jobs driven by this power plant investment, which could be jobs in the manufacturing facilities that are making the generation turbines, a whole range of inputs.
We're on the same page.
Okay.
So in the first table, all of those jobs, 6,100. The Rhode Island only jobs in this table, 1,900, which by my math is about 30% for the Rhode Island only. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with your math. Again, I'm not dealing with the most recent numbers for the facility, so that's the distinction I'm trying to draw here. I agree.
I'm with you.
With that
Subject to
yes.
any updates, which we've agreed are not all that significant, but so. All right, thank you.
Right.
Could I have just a second? The January 9 PA round 2018. I don't have it.
147, the first two pages of it are public.
Can we have that roll?
Yeah. 147, the public version.
Oh, she's good, isn't she?
She's the best.
I think we should all just leave it at her.
If you could go to the first page, please. Thank you. That's the memo. There is a letter.
It's the next
All
page.
right, the second page.
There you go. Okay, and if you could enlarge the table, please. Beautiful, wonderful. So Mr. Smith and Mr. Hardy, you both signed this letter, so either of you again can jump in, or both of you if you'd like to talk about it. But I'm reading this table and I'm going down to the bottom line on the table, which is bolded and said total earnings impact. Do you see that line?
I do.
And what I'm doing is I'm looking at the total earnings impact, Rhode Island only, which is what it says at the top. And I'm starting post-construction. So I'm starting with 2023 because the big numbers are driven by the construction jobs, correct? The earlier numbers, the first 4 years.
There are bigger numbers for the 4 years of construction than there would be for 4 years of operations.
So if I'm going to look at the employment and earnings impact for Rhode Island only, beginning with the first year of post-construction, on this chart I should start at 2023, correct?
If you wanted to just have the pure operations only years, that's when you would start. So,
Yes.
So the actual earnings from operations will begin earlier than that, with Clear River 1 coming online before Clear River 2.
I understand. But if I want to isolate operations, earnings, and employment impact for Rhode Island only, post-construction, the best place to start is 2023.
Correct.
Right. And then you've got this table running out through 2036, correct?
Correct.
Right. And so what I'm seeing, and correct me if I'm wrong, is I'm seeing the post-construction employment and earnings impact for Rhode Island only, starting with the $11 million and going up with only slight variations through 2036, going to $14.5 million. Did I read that table correctly?
You did.
Could I ask what you're assuming will be the necessary time that will be required to construct the plant?
Our assumption with the 2 units staggered is 41 months. To construct the first unit, our assumption is just under 2.5 years.
And what are you assuming about the time period that will be necessary to construct the transmission line interconnection?
I don't have an assumption on that.
Well, are you assuming that the transmission line interconnection will be completed on or before the commercial operation date of both units of the plant? Or would it be on or before the commercial operation date of the first unit of the plant so that it can then begin feeding electricity?
First unit.
First unit?
Yeah.
Okay. And there are no assumptions built into this model about the time period needed to construct the transmission line interconnect?
We've assumed in this model that construction starts January 1st, 2019. And so there's no transmission line assumption has changed our assumption about online date or start of construction date.
All right. Do you still believe that construction will begin on January 1st, 2019, based on what you know?
I do.
You do. You know we're in the summer of 2018.
I'm not an engineer who builds power plants, but from what I've heard, this is still a fair assumption, and it's our latest assumption.
Are you aware that the hearings that will be scheduled by this board to determine whether or not to permit the transmission line interconnect don't even begin until January of 2018 and continue through February of 19. Don't even begin until January of 2019 and continue through February of 2019, the hearings themselves.
If I may, I just want to correct. We assume that construction starts for the facility beginning in January of 2019. I don't think we've made a specific assumption that the transmission line construction begins in January of 2019.
Okay, that's
that's correct.
But you believe that construction on the power plant itself will begin in January of 19?
Correct, and that will be the start of construction, so that doesn't, you know, you're ramping up from there, of course, so that doesn't mean you have 500 people on site on January 1st, of course.
And if construction does not begin on January 1, 2019, because the permitting process is not yet finalized, then your numbers will all have to slide, assuming there's eventually a permit.
Our numbers would slide if the online dates, the projected online dates were to change.
All right.
And
If I could have just a minute, I do need to make some adjustments to carve out the jobs section from my other cross. Mr. Smith, you've been retained, and I want to ask both of you the same question, but you've been retained by Invenergy in this matter, is that correct?
Yes.
correct.
Correct. And have you ever worked for Invenergy before?
Yes.
Yes.
Let's start with you, Mr. Smith. What other work have you done for Invenergy?
I've probably contributed to small bits and pieces. I'm trying to separate the various phases of this assignment from other projects. I have contributed to various pieces of other power generation related analyses.
About how many other projects were involved?
2.
Did you work on the Pennsylvania project?
I did work on the Pennsylvania project, but in a very, very limited role.
Okay. Have you ever testified against the power plant project?
No.
Mr. Hardy, same questions. Could you tell me what other projects, generally speaking, a number is fine, you've worked on for Invenergy?
Sure, I've probably worked on half a dozen projects for Invenergy, everything related from, forecasting and valuation of power plants to strategic analysis, bidding strategies and a number of different types of analysis, all involving really power markets across both renewable and thermal generation.
Okay. And have you ever testified against a power plant?
I have not.
Mr. Smith, I'm looking at your pre-filed rebuttal testimony. Wish I could say I knew the exhibit number.
A.
Thank you so much. 76A. I don't think it needs to be on the screen, unless if you feel you need it, then I'm sure they'll bring it up for you. But on page 2, you said you were an expert witness and you submitted exhibits analyzing economic impacts associated with the Killingly Energy Center, and that this testimony was given to the Connecticut Siting Council. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you're aware, of course, that that proposed project was rejected by the Siting Council due to a lack of need?
I am aware of that. Or I'm aware of the fact that it was rejected. I can't speak to whether it was need specifically.
You never read the order?
I know that it was rejected by the council.
Did you read the order?
Start to finish, no, I did not.
You have no recollection what they found with regard to whether or not the plant was needed?
I'm stipulating that I don't know exactly why the plant was rejected. I do know it was rejected and knew it was rejected.
Okay. Could I ask you? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. You finished? Mr. Hardy, are you familiar with the rejection of the Killingly facility by the Connecticut Siting Council?
I am, and I believe it was rejected because it did not participate in clear a CSO. I don't believe that they rejected it based on the fact that it was not needed. I don't believe that was the conclusion of that order.
Okay, that's your opinion based on your reading of that order?
That's my opinion based on my reading of that order.
Okay. Let me start over again. The testimony of Mr. Tebaldi has been adopted by Mr. Smith, right? Correct?
Correct.
And you worked closely with Mr. Tebaldi in developing the original analysis that went into the supporting documentation for the first application, the initial application?
I did.
And for this purpose of today's hearing, we're focusing on section 5.1 primarily of the application, correct?
Correct.
Now, we didn't make any corrections to your testimony or to Mr. Tebaldi's testimony. I'm sorry, I think it's Dr. Tebaldi, isn't it? Maybe not. I don't know. I don't recall. But in any event, the testimony goes to some length about describing the economic benefits from 2018 to 2021 and during the construction period, and then going forward from there for the operations period. But I think we can all concede there will be no jobs in 18. So any reference to 18, I would assume you would stipulate needs to be ignored or taken out of the testimony. Would you agree with that?
Our latest results indeed reflect economic benefits starting in 2019. So I wouldn't say that 2018 numbers need to be taken out, but they at a minimum need to be moved forward to following years.
There will be no benefits in 2018, right?
Correct. I was just saying they don't go away, they move forward.
I get you, and I agree. That's all I have. Thank you very much.
May I clarify one small point that Mr. Hardy mentioned? Mr. Hardy, when Mr. McElroy was asking about prior work that you had done for Invenergy, one of the things you said is you had worked on bidding strategy. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And do you mean bidding strategy for participation in the ISO run forward capacity market?
No.
What do you mean?
It was actually around, there were some changes in the PJM market, so it was work around that. That's probably the most that I can say about that, other that it was in PJM and not New England.
Thank you.
Just a couple of points of clarification.
Just one question. Mr. Smith, the $170,000 in wages and benefits, would that include overtime and shift differential, or is there a different number for overtime and shift differential if the general contractor would use those two options?
That would include it. Yeah, so that $175,000, that is the wages divided by the number of jobs, which are outputs from the model. So yes, it would include overtime and benefits.
And shift differential? Do you know what that is?
Maybe you can clarify.
There's a second shift, usually there's a premium on that
Yes.
to the workers. A third shift, there's a premium on that to the worker.
Yes, it would. So time and a half, double time. Yes, it would be included.
Thank you.
Mr. Smith, a couple of things. The 6,000 jobs, those aren't all on-site jobs, are they?
The 6,000 jobs from the Rhode Island and the surrounding area, correct. They are not all on-site jobs.
In fact, your testimony is that 87% of the on-site jobs are Rhode Island jobs.
Of the on-site jobs, correct, 87% would be, the assumption would be in the construction phase that 87% of the on-site jobs would be Rhode Island jobs.
And Alan's going to ask, I can ask Mr. Hardy this, I guess. The Killingly project is in a different ISO zone, is it not? From the correct project?
That's correct. It's in Connecticut.
And in terms of, does Invenergy need a CSO to build Unit 2?
It does not.
And did you review the PUC opinion relative to correct?
I did.
And again, this is a little bit far afield, but I think the door opened a little bit, and I don't want to get into too much of it, but there was a discussion of it being beneficial to Rhode Island at the point that opinion was issued, correct?
That's correct.
And at that time, Unit 2 didn't have a CSO, is that correct?
That's correct. Unit 1 had a CSO. Unit 2 did not.
That's all I have. Thank you.
Is there another question?
Just a couple of questions. Back to the model that looks at the overall jobs in the region, about 6,000, we said. You said those are direct, indirect, and induced. Do you have a breakdown of what percentage of those are in each of those categories?
I definitely do not have a breakdown available to me right now. One could figure that out, yes, from the results, but I can't tell you right here.
And to go along with that, I'm curious if you have a sense of those 6,000 jobs, how many would be in Rhode Island versus in the greater region?
I do have the table for Rhode Island. I do not have the updated Rhode Island versus Rhode Island and the surrounding regions. We did that in the initial application, the Rhode Island and surrounding region element. We don't have that going forward, so I couldn't carry forward any proportion to future testimony.
So we'd like to make a record request for those 2 inquiries.
For the breakdown, that's no problem.
For the breakdown of the direct, the indirect, and induced, and then the number in Rhode Island and the region. Ward 1 and 2.
We can certainly provide that for Rhode Island only. We have not completed that analysis for Rhode Island and the surrounding region.
Can you complete it for the surrounding region?
Sure.
Thank you.
First, Mr. Hardy, we're going to be seeing you several days, and your testimony talks about a detailed description of your education and background. I only have this CV. Could you just, for the record, tell us what your educational background is? It doesn't say where you went to school.
Okay, I got a BSBA from Boston University in 1999, and an MBA from Boston University, and I think it was 2004.
Okay,
Subject to check.
Mr. Smith, I think between the questions from Mr. McElroy and some of the answers, I'm having trouble differentiating between the 87% on-site jobs for Rhode Islanders and the 100% in the chart we looked at that said labor was 100% in Rhode Island. I think Mr. McElroy was trying to point out the discrepancy, but are they talking about two different things?
The difference between those two is that the 87% speaks to the Rhode Island share during the construction phase. The 100% speaks to the Rhode Island share during the operations phase.
Okay. Thank you. That's all for me, Madam Chair.
Anyone else? Questions? Witnesses? Anybody still thinking about a question?
I am. You can't drag it out.
Just thought of it. It always seems to happen that when I say, okay, excuse me. Oh, wait!
We expect that from Jerry quite often.
So, there are no more questions right now. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
At least for now. Remember, you're going to be under oath the whole time.
Yes.
Until you get back.
Until you get back.
I believe those are all of the witnesses that we had scheduled for today, or do we?
We do have my last two witnesses for employment. We can
Okay.
put them up if you want, take a 5-minute break, whatever you want to do.
Do you need a break? Okay, we'll take a quick break.